Hi, Steve Brand here again. I'm here with Evan LePlainte from Core Sciences. And the most interesting thing I know about him is in his tagline for his company, which is, "We help companies become smarter." Evan, what does that mean?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it means a lot of things. It's fundamentally rooted in this idea that companies don't operate on individual brains, that they operate on group brains. And group brains often are not as intelligent as the individual brains within the group. And when we see that happen, we actually see that the ideas and decisions and subsequent actions that emerge from groups of people, whether that group is in marketing or sales or product management or engineering, we see those ideas miss the mark. So if we can help those groups become smarter so that their intelligence sums instead of competes, then the ideas and decisions and actions hit the mark and you get much better business results and a hell of a lot less frustration in companies. So that's what we do.
It's a good start. Now let's go backwards. Let's rewind a little bit. Who are you, and how has your career led you to where you are now?
I'm
Quickly.
still figuring out who I am, I guess you could say. But most of my career has been in data and analytics, and I've always had kind of an underlying interest in psychology and economics and engineering. Those were my degrees that I graduated from college with even. And I kind of called it the Dilbert dilemma for the longest time, which is the Dilbert comic is playing in this space of making fun of how the engineers don't understand business and the business people don't understand engineering. And wouldn't it really be something if they both understood each other? So I just always thought it would be interesting to try to be that guy. And that led me into the world of software. It led me into the world of data and analytics, where we look at the real world results of our actions. And, I like to joke that, when people ask me how I got from the world of data to the world of culture and psychology and teams and making companies smarter, it's a very logical conclusion because nothing wreaks more havoc on a room than a piece of data. You could throw a honey badger into a conference room and it wouldn't wreak a tenth of the turmoil and havoc on that room that a single spreadsheet about last quarter's marketing would. And that's because data brings about in people all sorts of emotional responses and social dynamics and defensiveness about decisions that we made in the past. And some people don't want that data to come to light, and other people do want that data to come to light. So nothing tests a company's culture or the health of its psychological makeup like data. And I had front row seats for 15 years to cultural and psychological issues that looked on the surface like operational ones, but were clearly much deeper. And I decided after selling a company to Adobe back in 2013 and working there for about 3.5 years, I decided that I'd try to spend the rest of my life and career on those underlying issues rather than continuing to scratch on the surface.
I know, Evan, you spent a lot of time in large corporations, and now I want to go backwards for you to shrink your thinking on this and to think about how does this notion of culture and teams and even data sort of reflect sort of an early stage entrepreneurial venture?
I mean, companies should start for cultural reasons, in a sense. There's two data sources for an entrepreneur to first realize that a company needs to exist in the world. One of those data sources is self-interest, and the data source that person will use is their own desire to monetize the world and take from the world. And they'll look at industry research and TAM analysis, addressable market sizes, where the money is that they can go get involved and extract some of those funds into their bank account. And ideally in exchange for some good or service that's legitimate in some way. But if you start from the standpoint of wanting to extract value from the world, the likelihood that you'll create something that's highly valuable is very low. The other key data source for entrepreneurship is compassion. And it's the opposite of self-interest. It's being deeply interested in others, specifically others' pain. And if you want to become an entrepreneur and you don't know what business to start, then just go ask 50 people that work in your industry what they hate most about their job. And there will be some patterns that emerge. and things that frustrate them, necessary processes in their life that really are unnecessary, barriers, problems, friction, challenges, frustration, anger, confusion, lack of clarity. Those trends that you find within those 100 conversations are businesses. And you start at that point from the standpoint of compassion, you're led to lead, or you're led to really solve the problem well. You'll have a good business.
It's really interesting. I've been interviewing entrepreneurs on a number of topics, and this notion of where do you learn? A lot of it comes out from jobs, just like you just said, either frustrated or they see an opportunity. I always say the best ideas come out of exit interviews, and the best business come out of exit interviews, because they're not given the culture doesn't allow the new ideas to flourish. Do you have any thoughts about that? That you just feel stifled in most large companies. Is that true?
Yeah, I mean, there are different prevailing cultures within organizations. And if we were to boil it down to a few, and there's this really great thing that people should read called Reinventing Organizations. There's like an illustrated version of it. It's an academic kind of a piece, but it's done exceptionally well. And it's talking through these different eras of companies and even of eras of society and what the culture feels like. And if we were to really distill that entire kind of set of characterizations of companies and cultures down to a few, it might be that you have autocratic cultures, which clearly are going to do what you just described. An autocratic culture is going to like you if you are doing the hierarchically distributed plan, and it's going to dislike you if you attempt in any way to reverse the flow of information, because in autocratic environments, information flows downward. And if you attempt to reverse the flow and provide feedback upward, you are seen as a problem, because you're disrupting the sanctity and focus that the autocratic environment has tried to establish. You see the opposite, which is harmony-obsessed environments. And I like to say that companies have at least two cultures. They have a culture in the work and a culture around the work. And you can kind of look at the culture around the work as this glow that emanates from great work. If a company does really great things and they get to enjoy that by having a high quality of life and a lot of harmony in the team, and they get to do things like go on neat adventures together and rope courses and colorful bicycles and free food and neat break rooms and stuff like that. And then other companies get that wrong and they adopt another company's culture around the work without realizing that it came from that other company's culture in the work, which is their quality standards, why they exist, how they communicate, how they become intelligent, how they create value. And they get the colorful bicycles and the ping pong tables and the beer and the break room and the free food, and they expect that the work itself to magically become better. But that culture of harmony around the work does the opposite of what the autocratic culture does. It actually destroys communication. Because if everybody's been told, oh, if you feel even remotely disturbed by anything anybody ever says about anything, then that information is inherently bad. And then we go back to that meeting where we talked about the data, the spreadsheet of last quarter's marketing results being thrown in. That's going to make a lot of people uncomfortable. And now we're going to say, well, I guess we shouldn't even look at the data because it makes people uncomfortable. We shouldn't talk about things. We shouldn't talk about quality that's not up to standard. It's really good that you designed that architecture in our critical systems last month, but you did it really poorly. But I'm afraid to say anything to you because I don't want to upset you. And that's how companies start to fall apart in a harmony-obsessed culture, which you'd think harmony is inherently a good thing, but it's not good when it destroys our ability to communicate with one another.
What's the common ground there? Like, how do you create one that at least is a pleasant place to be? And, that's harmony piece. It's nice to come to work, but at the same time, it's really focused on what the company should be focused on. How do you create that balance? Or is that not really the point?
Oh, it's very much the point. And I think that's kind of what the tug of war people are caught in, right? Is they go, well, if you don't have a harmonious environment, then do you have a disharmonious environment? And you go, no. You're getting cause and effect backwards. Harmony is an effect, not a cause. And it's an effect of human beings respecting each other and succeeding together and using what I would encourage companies to do it's a result of behaving Socratically. So Socrates had conversations with other people, not to blab on and on and on about what he knew and hear how smart he was from the other person and hear how much everybody agrees with him. He specifically began conversations to discover what he didn't know. So he would say, hey, Stephen, I've got this idea. I've been thinking about this for months. It's this, this, this. Can you tell me what am I missing here? And he would invite and make the purpose of the conversation your feedback. And what we're doing is we're taking the feedback that if I hadn't asked you for it, might create disharmony. If I said, Stephen, this is what I think, this is how I think the world works. And now you're going over there, oh God, that's not how the world works. Should I say something? And if you're in a harmony culture, no, I shouldn't say something. I should just let him keep believing that nonsense. But if I ask you in a Socratic environment, hey, I want to share a couple ideas with you, but the purpose of sharing those ideas is for you to criticize them and to tell me what I'm missing here. Like, this is how I think the world works. What am I missing? And you go, a whole bunch. I go, good. I'm glad I had this conversation with you. And now we're going to have harmony, but we're going to have harmony as an effect, right, instead of a cause. And that's the way that we can do it. We're just, curiosity, maybe if we broke it down to one word, curiosity is the word that gets us there. Are we curious when we enter conversation, or are we looking for validation of our ideas? And we require some vulnerability to become curious, and that's the trick. And we can talk about how to get there if you want.
Yeah, so how to get to curiosity? Is that what the...
Yeah, how to get to curiosity in an environment that has the safety where curiosity can thrive. Yeah. Is
curiosity learned, or is it, ingrained in different people? How do you learn how to be more curious? I mean, I've been asking questions since I was 2 years old. Like, can people just learn that? Or it's just like, you're either curious or you're not?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And the answer is yes, it's both. Some people are born more curious. Some people are born less curious. And, anybody can learn to be more curious. I think the problem is when cultures create a negative reinforcement loop. So I was just talking to a partner of ours yesterday on the phone about this. And they said, well, I can't ask people what I'm missing. They expect me to be an expert, and they'll probably say things like, you're supposed to know all this stuff. If you're asking that, maybe we should have gotten somebody else. And I said, well, part of it is, you can give them the digital salute and just give them 2 middle fingers and say, you're not the kind of place that deserves this kind of insight and talent. But the other side of it is that's not a safe environment, because nobody knows everything. And experts actually tend to be the most curious people. It's amateurs who pretend to know everything. And that effect that we're talking about is called the Dunning-Kruger effect, where a person who knows very little about something is likely to pretend like they know everything. And a person who really has a lot of experience is likely to say things like, trust me, this is complicated, right? Versus an amateur who's likely to say, oh, I've got this all figured out. So that's the thing. We don't want to penalize the people who say, trust me, this is complicated. We want to make sure that the amateurs who are pretending to be amateurs are very uncomfortable, and they're out in the sunlight. And we're saying, if you ever pretend to be certain about something, chances are you're an idiot. So that's kind of a starting point.
What's interesting about that is, I would think that the difference between a good, someone who's trying to raise money for their company in a good way versus a bad way is, if you're curious, does that lead to more investment money? I mean, is that something, that vulnerability, is that a good thing when someone's trying to either a big customer or an investor? Like, that notion of needing to know everything, how does that fit when you're playing outside the company with people on the outside, investors or big customers or whatever?
I mean, for customers, you're trying to solve their problems. So it really helps to be vulnerable and ask those questions. And, you share with me what your needs are. I'm an expert. I'm a supplier of goods or services that can help you out. And I'm going to say, okay, here's what I think I understand about your situation, because everybody's unique. This is what's going on these are the frustrations, these are the symptoms that are showing up, here are the people most affected. What am I missing here? And here's kind of the solution we're proposing for this. We think this will fit with this and this will fit with this based on past experience. What are we missing? Is there anything here that seems like it's out of alignment? So you're using it to productively move toward an answer. And I kind of talk about the difference between wanting to be right versus wanting to get it right. It's that the effort of the conversation is we're trying to get it right. And if we come at the conversation with the hope that we are going to be right, then we often miss our opportunity to get it right. It's not like we're coming to the conversation acting like we're clueless. We're coming to the conversation saying, we really are hell bent on getting this right. So let's make sure we're sweeping in the quarters. And if it makes you uncomfortable for me to ask you if I'm missing anything, then we probably also need to work on your culture and environment, because that's also screwed up, not just this problem.
Yeah. We started this conversation, or at least the series of interviews I've been doing, about how people learn. And you're uncovering this level of curiosity, this deep curiosity to learn from either customers or the people you work with. Do you have any pointers or ideas on how to sort of navigate the world? I mean, for you, how do you learn new things? Obviously, you've got a real depth of knowledge of teams and culture and, of course, analytics. Can you give me some sense of how you learn? If there's something new that you need to know, how do you do that?
Well, it's never been easier, that's for sure. It's not just Google; it's also Twitter and YouTube, and it's insane what we have at our fingertips now to learn. So for me, I got really interested about a year ago in the underlying neuroscience that sits underneath psychology. And for a long time, it's been a true statement that the social sciences are not exactly scientific, right? There's replicability issues, and there's a lot of legitimate complaints, and the legitimate complaints get conflated with the not so legitimate complaints. So if we have a replication issue with, let's say, some psychological research, and let's say, for sake of argument, 25% of all psychological research can't be replicated. Well, that doesn't mean that 100% can't be replicated. And we tend to get stuck in those things. So that's one of the problems that the kind of the flow of information is causing right now. But just as an example, I got into this, and what's building a bridge between social science and science was the magnetic resonance imaging machine, so an MRI. Now we can do these psychological things. We can induce certain emotions or ask certain types of questions or pose certain problems, and we can watch what happens in the brain physiologically while these things are going on, and link brain structure and psychology and thinking patterns and all sorts of things. So I got really into that, and that led me to Google, and it led me to Wikipedia, and it led me to all sorts of NIH studies that are published there in their library, and it led me to all sorts of stuff. So now I start thinking about things like, okay, you have that agreeable versus disagreeable person who uses compassion or self-interest to fuel their strategies for their business. And the compassionate person is going to use the data source of other people and their qualitative feedback, and the more self-interested person might use research and empirical kind of data, both of which are readily available today in various forms. And I got into that. Well, what's the underlying neuroscience there? And I was digging and digging and digging, and came across this article that was talking about this anterior, the anterior something cortex. It's located kind of here and here. And it's also associated with the release of oxytocin, which is a chemical that creates bonding. So when mothers are breastfeeding, oxytocin is being released, and that's the chemical that kind of bonds us to other people. And there's different things that release oxytocin. And, I know we're going down a tangent here, but it's just amazing to me that I could learn all this stuff and say, okay, wait, oxytocin is a thing that makes people notice each other more. It's a very interesting thing. Now I've got this underlying physiological neuroscientific idea. I understand the mechanics of agreeableness, the mechanics of Stephen, why you're a nice person who notices me and you ask me how I'm feeling and you actually mean it, and why another person doesn't. And it's because your focus includes your own thoughts, and it also includes me. And if I'm in the room, you'll notice me in some balance to your own thoughts. And a disagreeable person notices their own thoughts far more than they notice others. So they're caught up in their own internal dialogue in their internal world with their internal needs and their internal desires. And in proportion to those internal needs and desires, other people are not noticed or considered. And it's analog. So it's not like it's, you're either completely missing it or you got it this other way. There's every single gradient in between. So that's how I do it. I just kind of get hung up on a question. I see a watch that can tell me the moon phase. And I'm like, well, that's cool. How does that work? And I want to take the whole watch apart. And the internet lets me take the watch apart and learn what every part's called.
So, I'm an academic. I've read, hundreds and hundreds of articles, and they don't all agree with each other. So you're out there on the internet finding articles, and it's like, I now understand it. But wait a minute. I go find another article and they say something totally opposite, or the researcher positions it one way, and the old fake news or fake research, whatever. It's not fake. It's perspective. So what are your thoughts about how do you as a learner navigate differences of opinion, or different ways of communicating what they know, experts?
Yeah. So, that's a great question. And I think the question actually has some hidden attributes to it, because a lot of times when we say that A and B disagree, a great example, the same group of people that we were just talking about earlier, one of the guys sent me a message over Slack yesterday, and he included the CEO of Snowflake, who was interviewed on CNBC. And he was interviewed as saying, one of his go-to ideas in business is, if you could only do one thing, what would that be? What's the most important thing? And he asked everybody in the company that question. And if the person doesn't have an answer, then he says that person isn't prepared. And this guy, Mark, was asking me, what do you think about that? And I was like, personally, I think that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard in my life, because that company isn't going to do one thing ever. And people who have a deep understanding of the internal interconnectedness of systems that are at work inside of that business, as a systems thinker, you would never choose one part of a system to call the most important thing. You might choose subsystems or some components of it, but it just doesn't make any sense. And it also is very different than the advice Elon Musk might give you, which is you need to understand everything going on inside your entire company. You understand what all the robots do on the assembly line, and how the paint works, and how the suspension works, and the software that controls autopilot. And he compared to the CEO of Snowflake, shares an opposite philosophy. So if we come up to the layer of what's the right way of doing it, what's the tactic, what's the right tactic, you'll find tons and tons of disagreement up at that level, where you ask them both the same question and they give you two different answers. But if we can just get better at asking the question, recreating the environment of the question itself, we don't find so many different answers down at the question level. And one of the ideas is, a lot of companies have borrowed the phrase fail faster from Google. Again, thinking that's advice. It's one of those things that we can all agree on. Well, the advice fail faster, the answer of fail faster was the answer. It's like Jeopardy. The answer is fail faster. The question is, what is the way that we can accelerate our innovation and unleash our potential at Google, right? Now, Google uniquely at the time had the issue of having near genius people thinking about how to solve things. And the amount of refinement that they were working on ideas before feeling comfortable shipping that idea to the world was like nanometers of adjustment. And then companies, you come over to company XYZ, where they don't have a freaking clue what's going on around them. They're not geniuses that are completely overthinking something to death. They're not adjusting nanometers, they're adjusting miles. And they go, oh, let's adopt fail faster. Since we feel confused and paralyzed, let's just fail faster, and that's going to help us get through this. Well, if they asked the same question that Google asked, they wouldn't get the same answer. What's going to help us to innovate more productively and unleash our full potential? absolutely not fail faster as an idea for that company. So the question is the right question. How do we innovate and unleash our full potential? And the answer for Google looks like this, and the answer for you is going to look completely different. So I kind of tend to not get caught up in people's advice about what to do. I kind of get more caught up in what's the underlying set of questions that are the really, really, really good questions for us to ask ourselves so that we can creatively generate our own answer and use other answers potentially as just inspiration. But fail faster is such a good example of this because I hear it all the time in teams that are grossly underthinking and unaware of the environment around them. And all they do is fail always. They fail more spectacularly, more frequently, create more mistakes with more burden to clean up all the wreckage later than if they had just done nothing. They would literally be better off standing still than inducing the losses that come from fail faster.
So in terms of the culture, which I believe actually this notion of what you know and how you act in terms of fail faster, whatever it is. But if you go backwards to thinking about an early stage company, I'm a founder, I'm starting to build a team. I put on team members sometimes because I'm desperate, because I need someone to do it for free for a while, or I raise money and I can hire people who are smarter than me. But what do you think is a way, and I've worked with a lot of entrepreneurs who make the wrong decisions in who they're going to hire and partner with. They give them equity and they said, oh, that's going to be great, and nothing works out. So they have to reverse on that one. So what are your thoughts about an early stage entrepreneur who's starting to build a company? How do they build a culture of that you're recommending about curiosity and really success and not just fluff? Like, how do you get there when you're one person? Very soon you're going to be two people, and then you go to four, and then you go to eight. And then, of course, at some point, if you're successful, you're growing fast. What do you do at the early stage to make sure that the culture is one that is productive and not just toxic or too fluffy? That's not the word we use, but I'll use it.
No, intent. We talked earlier about the culture in the work and the culture around the work. So here's a great opportunity to dive into that. So even before you start working on culture, you need to be clear on your company's role. And if I die and only accomplish one thing in my life, I hope that thing is to stop companies from talking about their mission, because nobody gives a shit about your mission. And mission is a self-centered, insular concept. So we can say it's our mission to do this. And the words that we just said can be completely out of touch with reality. But central to our entire culture and the definition of our existence in everybody's shared psyche is this mission, which we will stubbornly pursue, even as the world is trying to tell us, no, it's not working. That's not what we want. So a company's role is an adaptation to mission. So mission is an expression of supply. We are here to do this. Role is where supply and demand meet. It's the role we play in the world. And ideally, a role sounds something like the world is really glad core science exists because. And now I'm going to explain why the world is really glad we exist, where the demand and the supply are to meet. And though much of the world is still unaware that core sciences exist, but I know they have the problems and the pain that we solve. We make their life better. We make their ideas better, their decisions better, their results better, their efficiency better, their quality of life better. When you do the things that we do, you work much more easily and you get way better results. And that's kind of the idea. So I know the world's glad we exist. I know our clients and our customers are glad that we exist. And I want everybody in my company to feel the obligation that's associated with a role. The world's glad we exist. Well, if I'm about to take an action and the center of our entire existence and culture is based on this role, my action needs to fulfill that role. I am obligated to the world. That's why we're here, for them, at their pleasure. So I better make a good decision right now, or the world's not going to be glad that we exist. Versus our mission, we can just sit here in our own little centrifuge, not paying attention to the world and thinking we're doing a great job when we're doing something completely irrelevant or something that the world doesn't want to exist. So culture, the culture of production that we talked about before, the culture in the work, is how we believe we fulfill the role. It's a philosophical set of ideas that come from the role. So if we're obligated to make companies smarter and help them improve quality of life, well, how are we going to do that? Not just operationally yet. We're not there yet. How are we going to do that from the standpoint of setting up our team? What kind of people do we need to do that? What kind of rhythms do we need to do that? What kind of level of quality do we need to deliver to people? And what kind of communication do we have to have internally to be successful in fulfilling that role? So when you think about the culture and the work, you're thinking about your role, you're thinking about how you create value and how you create value internally too. Like when we create value, if you and I are having a conversation about fulfilling that role, how are we going to make that? How are we going to make me asking you what I'm missing the most valuable exchange possible? We need to have an agreement on the quality that we create so that when we both create something and bring them together, this isn't made out of cardboard and this is made out of titanium, right? We have to agree that everything's made at least to an 8 out of 10 or above, for example. And we have to have clear communication and understanding of like what it's like to communicate internally and externally and how we become intelligent. So the philosophy of intelligence is what we really focus on most as a business. How do you become super smart so you're aware, situationally aware? And I love this framework that the Air Force invented called the OODA loop, which is observe, orient, decide, act. And then you start the process over again, because as soon as you act, you can now observe the result of your actions and you can now reorient. You can make new decisions, take new actions. Great companies, adaptable companies, are in an OODA loop that it has a pretty high RPM, right? It's rotating, it's happening very, very quickly. Bad companies, the worst, are in OODA lines, that they observed something a long time ago, they oriented to that thing, probably poorly, they made decisions, and then they had quote unquote commitment, right? And they committed to those decisions and they are stubbornly forging ahead without looking around at the world around them. So intelligence and the OODA loop are the same thing. How aware, what are we observing? How smart are we? How much do we know? How much can we see? And if we can't see and we don't know very much, we're not smart. We're not intelligent. And then we have to communicate that intelligence to each other Socratically, like we talked about. That helps us build things of value that are of high quality. So that culture in the work naturally manifests itself when we ask ourselves the question, how do we fulfill the role? And then the third layer that role and culture goes through next is our team. If our team is psychologically matched to our culture and to our role, then the team is a hyper-conductive material that continues bringing our role to life in their actions. If our team is mismatched psychologically, like if our role is to do something really good for society and we hire people who are low in agreeableness and self-centered, then they will act as an insulating layer that prevents the role from carrying forward into our actions. What we'll see in our actions is that individual's psychology. We'll see self-centered actions that come from the person, not from the role. So it's really important to create alignment in these layers, but you work your way outwards. You start with your role, then you build that culture of production in the work. Then you think about your team and whether your team is conductive or insulating the role. Then you understand the physiology of your team at any moment in time, and then you can create strategy. Strategy needs to be derived from physiology in a sense, like the NFL coach needs to design plays that his team physiologically is able to run. And if the coach creates plays that are beyond the physiology of the team, then the team will break when they attempt to run the plays. So it's those 5 kind of steps, from role to culture to team to physiology to strategy. Strategy is where we finally decide what we're going to do with all these inner layers.
Evan, I've learned I could talk to you for hours and we'll never end, but I do need to sort of come to a close. I'm going to have to do another interview with you soon, but I do want to ask one more question, and that is, as a former professor, I guess I'll always be a professor, but I always think students come to me and say to me, should I start a company right out of school or make my way into a full-time job and then figure out what I want to do? From the idea of curiosity and being naive, is it better to be naive and start a company, or is it better to be experienced and frustrated and then make your way out to start a company based on what you've learned or do not like in the company that you've in, if that's the case? Do you have any thoughts about that? If you were giving advice to a 22-year-old before they leave the comfort of home and of school, what do you suggest?
Boy, this is one of those answers versus questions types type of things. So I'll try to create a flexible enough answer. But something that does come to mind is, if by your nature, by your disposition, you tend to be a rebel, you might as well just start a company right off the bat. You can go get a job and you'll probably feel weird and out of place. And maybe you do that to learn something, knowing that you're always going to be out of place. You're going to end up doing something. Like, I feel like the most unemployable person on planet Earth. And that's why I've been an entrepreneur so many times, because I have to do it that way. I just don't feel like I fit in. If you do fit in, if you are not a rebel, maybe the advice there would be to consider starting the company immediately, so that you don't get comfortable fitting in somewhere. Because I see so many people who would be brilliant entrepreneurs who have had 10 or 15-year careers in a corporate environment, and they're getting pretty cozy, and they, or at least financially cozy. They're saying, okay, I'm making this money. I'm thinking about starting a startup. How am I going to make this make sense at this point? Here's my projections if I stay in this job. Here's my projections if I become an entrepreneur. And I talk to these people, 3 or 4 times a month, different people reach out, and we end up having a conversation. And I always ask them, like, are you happy? And they're like, no, I'm freaking miserable. And I'm like, well, okay. Do the people around you know that you're miserable? No, they think I'm happy. And I go, well, you fit in really well. And now you're just stuck between a rock and a hard place with the decision. It's not as clear for you. But if you're unhappy, that kind of sucks. So if fitting in is going to lead you to an eventuality in corporate America, to being unhappy later, but being stuck and paralyzed in this decision, you might as well get started earlier, because the first few years are going to be rough. And then if you can be in business 5 years after you start, set a goal not to be gigantic in year 2. Set a goal to still exist in year 5. And if you still exist in year 5, and it's not because you're using a trust fund to pay for the company, you are going to be successful. So companies, there's a lot of like pop culture advice about growing super fast. What kills a lot of really good companies, they try to grow too fast. They outpace the market. The market's not ready to buy. They spend all their money before the attention turns to them and the world adapts a little bit, and poof, they don't last long enough to wait for the heyday.
That's great advice. I want to thank you very much for your wisdom, which I always find I come like totally refreshed after I finish a conversation with you. I think you got a lot to offer. You can, and it's very, applicable to both the large companies and the small companies. And what I really appreciate is sort of your way of looking at the way to work better. And this culture issue is extremely important. So I've learned a lot. I always learn a lot from chatting with you, and I hope other people have as well. So thank you very much for your time, Evan. I really appreciate it. And I think it's going to be really helpful for people who listen. So thanks a lot.
Yeah, absolutely.